Earlier day, a retired judge living in the quiet community of Merritt Island decided to head outside for some yard maintenance. His home sat along the edge of the Indian River, offering a clear view of the water. As he was getting ready to start mowing the lawn, something near the shoreline caught his eye. At first glance, it appeared to be a large object, possibly a piece of driftwood or maybe even an animal resting near the edge. Curious, he took a few steps closer. Realizing the seriousness of the situation, he promptly contacted local authorities. When law enforcement officers arrived, they carefully assessed the scene. From the very beginning, the case presented several complications. There were no personal effects nearby, no form of ID, phone, or wallet. Investigators turned to fingerprint analysis in hopes of finding a lead. The prints led them to a positive identification, a woman named Misty Morse. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. In this documentary, we'll examine real photos and evidence from the case involving Misty Morse. She was born on April 10, 1978, in the peaceful Midwestern town of Springfield, Ohio. She was the only child of James and Lorraine Morse, a couple known in their community for their warmth and dedication to their daughter. Misty had a bright and infectious personality from the start. She was curious about the world, always eager to explore, and deeply loved by those around her. When Misty was still a child, her family made the decision to relocate, moving to the sunny coastal city of Indian Harbor Beach in Florida. It was a major transition, but one that brought new opportunities for the young girl. Unfortunately, not long after settling into their new lives in Florida, her parents' marriage began to fall apart. They eventually filed for divorce, a difficult moment in Misty's life, though not one that broke her spirit. She chose to live with her mother, Lorraine, but she remained very close to her father, often spending weekends and holidays with him. The separation didn't fracture their family bond entirely. Instead, Misty became more emotionally resilient and mature beyond her years. As she grew older, Misty flourished in the beachside environment. She was known for her sunny disposition and became well-loved in her neighborhood and school community. With a natural love for the outdoors, she spent countless hours at the beach, swimming in the ocean, learning to surf, and lounging on the sand with her tight-knit group of friends. She thrived in social settings, often the one to bring people together, her laughter echoing across the shoreline. After graduating from high school, Misty didn't rush into a career. Instead, she explored different paths, working a few jobs around town while trying to discover where her true passions lay. Eventually, she enrolled in a local community college, hoping that time and experience would help her find clarity. By the summer of 2000, she was 22 years old and living a life that many young adults could relate to, balancing part-time classes with her job as a waitress at a cozy seaside cafe, spending her free hours socializing with friends, enjoying the Florida sun, and embracing the carefree rhythm of early adulthood. On the evening of July 20th, Misty had what appeared to be a typical night ahead. She told her mother she was heading out, and the two chatted casually for a few minutes in the kitchen. Just as they were wrapping up their conversation, Misty's phone rang. She picked it up, responded with only a few short words, and hung up quickly. Her tone changed slightly, and she told her mom she needed to leave right away. Lorraine thought nothing of it at the time. Misty was independent, responsible, and often out with friends, so a quick departure wasn't out of the ordinary. However, the following day, Misty hadn't come home. Her mother, returning from work, noticed the house was unusually quiet. Still, she wasn't overly concerned. Misty often worked late shifts or occasionally spent the night at a friend's place, especially during weekends. But when another day passed with no word, no calls, no texts, no signs of life, Lorraine's concern began to grow. What made it more unsettling was the shared car situation. Misty and her mother rotated the use of one vehicle between them every week, and it was Misty's turn to pick it up. But she never showed. That was not like her at all. Lorraine tried calling her daughter's phone multiple times. Each call went unanswered. No voicemails, no texts, nothing. As days passed without any contact, the worry that had started as a small unease quickly escalated into deep anxiety. By July 24, 4 days since she last saw her daughter, Lorraine knew something was seriously wrong. She was preparing to go to the police and report Misty missing. But just as she was about to leave, there was a knock at the door. Standing there was a local police officer. The moment Lorraine opened the door and saw the look on the officer's face, her heart sank. Before a single word was spoken, she sensed the unimaginable. The officer delivered the devastating news. Misty had been found. The discovery had been made the previous day, July 23rd. Earlier that morning, a retired judge residing in nearby Merritt Island had gone outside to do some yard work. His home bordered the Indian River, and as he prepared to mow his lawn, he glanced toward the water. At first, he assumed it might be a large piece of debris or perhaps even an animal. But as he stepped closer, he realized it was something far more disturbing. He immediately contacted the authorities. When police arrived at the scene, they quickly confirmed that the object was, in fact, human. The discovery was treated with the utmost seriousness and respect, and a full investigative team was dispatched. However, from the start, investigators were confronted with challenges. The condition of the surrounding evidence complicated their efforts. It was evident that this was not a natural death, but the exact cause of death was unclear. Forensic experts noted that the state of the evidence made it difficult to draw definitive conclusions early on. Strangely, there were no obvious signs of a DNA, fingerprints, or identifiable markings were immediately present. Everything appeared to have been deliberately cleaned or chosen to avoid detection. The lack of forensic evidence meant detectives had very little to go on. The immediate priority became identifying the victim. Without a wallet, phone, or any personal belongings, they turned to fingerprints. Fortunately, a match came back quickly. Misty Morse. It was a heartbreaking confirmation. Detectives returned to Lorraine's home that same day, now with a new purpose: to speak with Misty's mother and gather more information. They wanted to understand her habits, her recent interactions, and any potential connections that might offer a lead. Lorraine, though still in shock, did her best to recall every detail. She told them about the phone call the night Misty left, the shift in her demeanor, and how unusual it was for her daughter to be out for more than a day. Back at the forensic lab, investigators re-examined the collected materials. The duct tape of particular interest. On it, analysts found several short, dark hairs. They clearly did not match Misty's lighter hair, suggesting they might belong to another person, possibly the individual responsible. The hairs were carefully preserved and sent for further testing in the hopes of identifying a DNA profile. This became one of the few concrete pieces of evidence in an otherwise perplexing case. Despite these efforts, the mystery of what happened to Misty Morse remained largely unsolved. After collecting all the evidence, investigators went to talk to her mother again. Misty Morse's mother, Lorraine, sat down with investigators just hours after receiving the most devastating news of her life. Through the waves of shock and grief, she recalled the last time she saw her daughter alive. It was the evening of July 20th. Lorraine remembered the moment with vivid clarity, replaying every detail as if hoping that one small thing could somehow unravel the mystery. She explained that Misty had been in good spirits that day, behaving completely normally. They had exchanged casual conversation in the kitchen, and there was nothing in her demeanor to suggest that anything was wrong or that she felt unsafe. Then, seemingly out of nowhere, Misty received a short phone call. The conversation was brief, just a few words, and when it ended, Misty quickly told her mom she had to leave. It appeared as though someone had arrived outside and was calling to let her know they were waiting. But Misty never said who the person was. She didn't mention any names, give any hints, or even indicate where she was headed. It was a small moment that didn't seem important at the time, but in hindsight, it took on a haunting weight. Detectives zeroed in on that phone call as a possible key to unlocking the entire case. They immediately submitted a request for Misty's phone records, hoping to trace the call and identify who she might have met that evening. But their hopes were quickly complicated by the limitations of technology at the time. In the early 2000s, mobile phone providers were still in the process of developing more sophisticated systems for data retention. As a result, they weren't able to provide the identity or number associated with incoming calls, only outgoing ones. The only concrete detail detectives could uncover was that Misty had received 2 calls that night. The first lasted a few minutes. The second was very short, only a few seconds, and was most likely the call her mother overheard right before she left the house. Without caller ID logs, investigators hit an unexpected and frustrating wall. The search for additional clues led detectives to Misty's bedroom. They combed through every drawer, closet, and surface, looking for anything out of place or potentially relevant to the case. Her purse was there on the nightstand, sitting just where she always left it. Inside were all of her everyday items: keys, wallet, makeup, and some receipts. But two things were missing: her driver's license and her cell phone. The absence of those two items told a subtle but significant story. If Misty had intended to be gone for an extended period, she would have taken her purse. But she didn't. That suggested she had only planned to step out briefly. She likely believed she'd be back home shortly. Tragically, that moment never came. As the investigation advanced, forensic experts began analyzing the materials recovered from the riverside. While the ropes, plastic coverings, and duct tape yielded very little DNA or biological evidence, there were other clues hidden in their composition. Investigators noted that the rope used had a very specific texture and weave. It was the kind commonly used on boats. This type of marine-grade rope is designed to endure saltwater exposure, and it's often used in sailing or fishing activities. The knots used in the binding were also noteworthy. Forensic examiners pointed out that the way the rope had been tied was not random. These were structured knots, secure and efficient, the kind often taught in military or maritime training programs. Specifically, the style resembled knots used by those with experience in the Navy or Coast Guard. The duct tape, too, was unusual. It wasn't the kind you'd find in a typical household. It was a specialized brand designed for emergency repairs on marine vessels, meant to endure tough conditions. All of this suggested that the person responsible had access to a boat and likely possessed advanced knowledge of maritime practices, possibly from military service or professional boating work. With these clues in hand, detectives redirected their attention to Misty's personal life. They began conducting interviews with friends, family, co-workers, anyone who might have information about recent people in her orbit. That's when Misty's mother brought up a name: Teddy. Misty had been casually dating him in the weeks. According to Lorraine, Teddy was introduced to Misty through one of her co-workers. Their connection seemed casual, just a few dates, nothing too serious. But given the circumstances, detectives decided to dig deeper. When police ran a background check on Teddy, they found some troubling history. He had a lengthy criminal record. The pattern raised red flags, and detectives quickly brought him in for questioning. During the interview, Teddy acknowledged that he and Misty had spent time together, but he insisted that their relationship had ended amicably. He said they hadn't seen each other in over a week, and he expressed genuine sorrow. Detectives observed his behavior closely, searching for signs of deceit. But Teddy didn't show the kind of nervousness or evasion they were expecting. He answered every question directly and even seemed emotionally affected by the loss. As a precaution, investigators asked him to provide a DNA sample. Although they didn't yet have any DNA from the suspect, it was a useful way to gauge Teddy's willingness to cooperate. Without hesitation, he agreed. He even offered to let them search his apartment, no warrant required. The search yielded nothing suspicious. No boating gear, no marine ropes, no duct tape of the same type. Furthermore, police confirmed that Teddy had no military background and no known access to any watercraft. With no physical evidence tying him to the crime and no behavioral signs of deception, investigators began to question whether Teddy had anything to do with what had happened to Misty. As Teddy was cleared, attention shifted once again, this time to another name: Bobby. One of Misty's relatives mentioned that she had gone on a single date with him not long before her disappearance. At first glance, Bobby didn't appear to be a person of interest. He didn't have a criminal record, and his name had never come up in any of the initial inquiries. But then detectives learned something that made them look closer. After their date, Misty had confided in a few friends. She told them that she didn't feel a spark with Bobby, that he wasn't really her type, and she didn't plan on seeing him again. It wasn't a dramatic breakup, just a simple lack of interest. Bobby had not taken Misty's silence lightly. At first, it seemed like he simply didn't understand personal boundaries. She said he always seemed to find excuses to be nearby or reach out, even when she clearly indicated she didn't want further contact. Although she never filed a formal complaint, the fact that she'd spoken about it so openly stood out to investigators. That was enough for detectives to pay Bobby a visit. When they arrived at his home, they were greeted by a seemingly cooperative man who didn't hesitate to open the door. But as they scanned his property, one detail caught their eye immediately. Parked just off to the side of the house, partially covered by a tarp, was a small recreational boat. Given the evidence recovered from the scene of Misty's death, marine rope, specialized duct tape, and the likelihood of access to a watercraft, this discovery immediately raised their level of interest. Bobby agreed to speak with them without resistance. Sitting down with the detectives, he tried to appear composed. He said he wasn't particularly bothered that Misty had stopped responding to him and described their date as pleasant but uneventful. However, he also openly admitted that he had continued calling her, daily, right up until July 23rd. He claimed that once he found out what had happened, he stopped calling out of shock and sadness. For a while, the conversation followed a predictable path. But then, without warning, Bobby did something completely unexpected. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a small object. When he handed it over to the detectives, they were stunned. It was Misty's driver's license. He explained the situation with an air of casualness that didn't sit well with investigators. According to Bobby, Misty had handed him her ID on the night of their date because she hadn't brought a purse or any clothing with pockets. She had asked him to hold on to it, and afterward, he said, she simply forgot to take it back. But detectives weren't convinced. That date had taken place weeks ago. It was difficult to believe that Misty would misplace something as important as her ID and never mention it again. Even more puzzling, if Bobby had been trying to get in touch with her for days, why didn't he mention the ID then? Or try to return it? Suspicion mounting, the investigators asked Bobby for permission to conduct a search of his home. He agreed without hesitation, and a full team swept through the residence from top to bottom. They searched drawers, closets, the garage, even the boat itself. But when all was said and done, there was nothing physically linking Bobby to Misty's disappearance or death. No marine rope matching the kind used. No tools or tape similar to what had been found. And perhaps most notably, no military background. Bobby had never served in the armed forces, nor had he ever received maritime training of any kind. That alone created a conflict with the working profile of the suspect. Although Bobby's behavior was strange, and the ID discovery left many unanswered questions, detectives reluctantly had to put him in the no physical evidence column. It was possible he was just an awkward man with poor boundaries, nothing more. But just as the officers were preparing to leave, Bobby offered up one more piece of information, almost like an afterthought. He told them that during their one and only date, Misty had brought up an ex-boyfriend. According to Bobby, she had mentioned that this ex had a reputation for being aggressive and overbearing. Bobby didn't recall the man's name, but he did remember one important detail. The ex had served in the Marines. That statement hit a nerve with the detectives. The idea of a former Marine with potential access to boats and specialized training immediately brought them back to the evidence found near the Indian River. They needed to find out who this man was. So they turned back to Misty's mother. When they posed the question to Lorraine, whether Misty had ever dated someone with a military background, she didn't hesitate. Yes, she said. His name was Brent Huck. Lorraine went on to explain that Brent and Misty had been involved in a serious relationship that lasted for quite some time. She remembered those days well, not necessarily for good reasons. Misty had shared more than once that Brent could be controlling. He often demanded to know where she was, who she was spending time with, and even what she was wearing. At first, Misty thought it was just concern disguised as protectiveness. Eventually, she made the difficult decision to end the relationship. That had been about a year before her death. After the breakup, Misty had cut off contact. To Lorraine's knowledge, Brent had not reached out to her daughter again. At least not in any way Misty had spoken about. Detectives began digging into Brent Huck's background, and what they found was more than enough to raise their eyebrows. Brent lived only a few miles away. He was an honorably discharged Marine, which matched the behavioral profile suggested by the evidence. And perhaps most notably, Brent now worked as a charter boat captain, giving him daily access to boats, marine-grade rope, duct tape, and specialized tools. Exactly the kind of materials used in the crime. This discovery marked a potential turning point in the investigation. However, the detectives knew they had to proceed carefully. They didn't want to spook Brent or give him any reason to shut down. So they came up with a non-confrontational approach. Rather than accuse him outright or reveal what they knew, they reached out under the pretense of gathering information about Misty's social life as part of a broad investigation with no specific suspects. Brent agreed to meet. During the interview, he remained calm, collected, and oddly confident. He acknowledged that he and Misty had dated seriously for a time, and he admitted that even after their breakup, they had remained in occasional contact. But according to him, their relationship was completely over. He insisted there was no lingering attachment, no romantic tension, nothing that would connect him to her disappearance. Still, there was something off about Brent's demeanor. Unlike other people they'd interviewed, people who had genuinely seemed shaken by Misty's death, Brent's tone was noticeably different. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't sad. In fact, he bordered on smug. The arrogance in his posture and language made the detectives increasingly uneasy. It wasn't what he said. It was how he said it. As the conversation continued, they pushed further. When asked if he recalled the last time he'd spoken with Misty, Brent didn't hesitate. He answered clearly and with certainty. Wednesday, July 20th, the very night Misty disappeared. The date Brent mentioned, Wednesday, July 20th, was the same night Misty told her mother she was heading out after receiving a short phone call that abruptly ended their conversation. Lorraine remembered the moment with precision. Brent claimed that although he had called Misty that evening, twice to be exact, they never actually met up. According to him, the calls were brief and uneventful. He insisted that they spoke over the phone but did not see each other in person that night. However, that version of events didn't sit well with detectives. The timing was just too convenient, and what Misty's mother had told them painted a different picture entirely. Lorraine had described the call Misty received as very short, just a few words, followed by her leaving. And Misty's phone records confirmed that she hadn't received any other calls that evening aside from 2 incoming ones, both from Brent. If she left immediately after that second call, it seemed overwhelmingly likely that Brent was the one waiting for her outside. Still, Brent stuck to his version of events. He said the reason he called Misty that night had nothing to do with meeting in person. According to him, he had recently heard that she was telling people, rumors that, if true, could have serious consequences for his current relationship. At the time, Brent was dating someone new, and he claimed he simply wanted Misty to stop spreading lies that could damage his life. He told detectives the calls were only meant to clarify the situation and ask her to stop. The next logical step was to ask Brent for permission to search his property. Surprisingly, he agreed, just as previous suspects had. But this time, the results were very different. In Brent's kitchen, detectives noticed several plastic shopping bags tucked into a drawer near the sink. At first glance, they appeared ordinary, just typical grocery bags, the kind used by millions of people. But investigators decided to collect them anyway, thinking about the plastic that had been found. Forensic analysts took the bags to a lab and examined the manufacturing codes. Tiny stamped sequences printed at the time of production. What they found was disturbing. The bags from Brent's kitchen and the plastic found at the scene had matching batch numbers. They had been produced in the same factory, on the same day, on the same production line. That narrowed the possible origin significantly and linked the materials in Brent's home to the crime in a way that could not easily be brushed aside. Encouraged by the discovery, detectives expanded their search to the garage. What they found next sent chills down their spines. There, hanging from a wall hook, was a spool of rubber cord, the exact same type that had been recovered from the scene. As with the plastic bags, investigators recorded the serial number printed on the cord and cross-checked it with forensic samples. Once again, it matched. The cord at Brent's home had been manufactured on the same machine, part of the same production batch. That kind of match wasn't just coincidence. It strongly suggested a connection. Further into the garage, tucked into a storage bin, detectives discovered a roll of specialized marine duct tape, identical in color, width, texture, and adhesive type to the tape found at the scene. The tape was known for its durability in harsh environments, most commonly used for boat repairs or outdoor applications. And then came perhaps the most damning piece of all: a length of marine rope, matching not only in material, but tied with the exact same military style. At this point, investigators knew they had moved beyond speculation. The evidence, while still technically circumstantial, was overwhelming in its specificity. The number of overlapping materials, the matching production batches, the specialized tape, and the style of knots. All of it created a picture that pointed directly to Brent. The circumstantial evidence was starting to take on the weight of something much more substantial. Detectives began to build a theory. Brent may have heard rumors, true or not, that Misty was saying something that could harm his current relationship. Given his past behavior, detectives believed it was possible that Brent felt his reputation or personal life was under threat, and instead of addressing it rationally, he may have panicked. That panic, they theorized, could have turned into a tragic and irreversible decision. With a growing pile of forensic connections, the investigative team brought their case to the district attorney, hoping to move forward with formal charges. But what happened next left everyone stunned. Despite the clear narrative built from weeks of investigative work, the prosecutor declined to pursue charges. He explained that while the evidence was compelling, it was all circumstantial. There were no eyewitnesses, no confession, and no direct forensic link like DNA. Everything relied on patterns, probabilities, and connections, but nothing irrefutable. He warned that bringing this case to court as it stood could result in an acquittal, and without a solid, direct link, they were unlikely to secure a conviction. In short, it wouldn't hold up in front of a jury. It was a crushing blow for the detectives, who felt they had finally reached the threshold of justice. They had a suspect with motive, opportunity, and access to materials found at the scene, but it still wasn't enough. Yet there was one more clue, a forensic detail that had intrigued the team from the start. On the duct tape, analysts had found several short, dark hairs. They were not Misty's and didn't match any known human profiles. Further testing revealed the source. They were animal hairs, specifically canine in origin. As it happened, Brent owned a large black dog, a mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler. It was exactly the type of animal that could leave behind coarse, dark hairs. Detectives strongly suspected that the tape had come from Brent's home and had picked up the hairs either before or during the incident. But once again, science hit a frustrating limit. At the time, no forensic labs in the country had the technology to conduct a reliable DNA analysis on dog hair. Without the proper technology at their disposal, detectives were stuck. The short, dark hairs found on the duct tape, now confirmed to be from an animal, most likely a dog, might have held the final clue to link Brent to the scene. So, just like that, the investigation hit a wall. With no additional suspects, no confessions, and no new leads emerging, the case slowly ground to a halt. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. And still, Misty's killer remained unidentified in the eyes of the law, free, uncharged, and walking among the public. Over time, the case became one of many unsolved files sitting in the cold case cabinet. But for the detectives who had worked the investigation, Misty's face still lingered in their minds. Even as other cases demanded their attention, they would occasionally revisit Misty's file, hoping that something, anything, might leap out at them. 2 long years passed. Then, almost by accident, a spark reignited the investigation. One of the lead detectives came across a news article about a recent homicide case in California. It detailed how investigators there had used advanced animal DNA testing to match hair found at a crime scene to a suspect's dog. It was the first time the lab had publicly confirmed such testing had become reliable enough to hold up in court. For the Florida detectives, this wasn't just interesting. It was potentially game-changing. Without hesitation, they contacted the same specialized lab that had conducted the analysis in California. They sent over the preserved samples, the short, dark dog hairs that had been recovered from the duct tape at the crime scene. They also secured a fresh DNA sample from Brent Huck's dog, a large black mix between a German Shepherd and a Rottweiler, the very same breed detectives had long suspected based on the forensic characteristics of the hair. The lab worked carefully. Weeks later, the results came back. It was a perfect genetic match. The hairs found on the duct tape were from the same dog that lived in Brent's home, his dog. And there was something even more profound about the discovery. In speaking again with Misty's mother, detectives learned that Misty herself had given Brent that dog as a gift during their relationship, back when things were still good between them. The connection wasn't just biological. This wasn't a coincidence. This was a critical link, a living trace from Brent's own home, directly tied to the crime scene. With this new cutting-edge forensic evidence now in their possession, the detectives returned to the district attorney. This time, they weren't presenting just circumstantial overlaps. They were offering scientific proof, tested and validated, linking Brent's home and his dog directly to the items found with Misty. The prosecutor reviewed the newly submitted lab reports and agreed. It was enough. On October 23, 2002, Brent Huck was officially arrested for the murder of Misty Morse. The arrest brought a wave of bittersweet relief for Misty's family and for the detectives who had refused to give up, even when the trail had gone cold. Months later, Brent's trial began in front of a packed courtroom. By then, the case had garnered local media attention and emotions were running high. Despite the serious charges, Brent showed no signs of remorse or fear. He pleaded not guilty and maintained his innocence throughout the proceedings. He claimed that he had nothing to do with Misty's disappearance or death. He pointed the finger at other men Misty had dated in the past, suggesting that one of them must have been responsible. He tried to portray himself as just another former boyfriend unfairly caught in a web of suspicion. But his defense couldn't compete with the mountain of evidence laid out by the prosecution. Prosecutors presented a compelling case. They walked the jury through the timeline, the phone records. They outlined how the marine equipment and military-style knots pointed to someone with Brent's background. And finally, they presented the breakthrough, the animal DNA match, tying everything together with undeniable scientific credibility. In the end, the jury was unanimous. Brent Huck was found guilty of both kidnapping and murder in the first degree. The judge sentenced him to 2 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, ensuring that he would spend the rest of his days behind bars. On the morning of Monday, June 29th, concern began to mount when Dr. Teresa Severs failed to show up for work. Shortly afterward, a close friend of Teresa's, who was also a professional colleague, grew worried and decided to check in on her. She made her way to Teresa's home, hoping it was simply a misunderstanding or delay. Upon arriving at the Severs residence, everything appeared normal from the outside. The doors were closed, the windows intact. There were no immediate signs of forced entry or disturbance. With a sense of growing unease, the friend used a spare key to enter the house. When she got inside, she called out to Teresa. Then, in the midst of that unsettling quiet, the friend made a devastating discovery. What had started as a routine check-in had turned into the beginning of a horrifying and tragic mystery. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Teresa Ann Severs was born in Connecticut on November 19, 1968, in a family that valued hard work, ambition, and the pursuit of knowledge. Friends from her childhood recall that she always had a keen interest in science and a genuine empathy for those around her, qualities that foreshadowed her destiny in the medical field. Throughout her high school years, Teresa balanced academic pursuits with a love for community service, consistently volunteering at local shelters and neighborhood improvement projects. She carried this philosophy to medical school and beyond, vowing to practice medicine in a way that emphasized empathy and holistic treatment approaches. After completing her education, Teresa ventured into various roles that allowed her to refine her focus on integrative health. She was known to research cutting-edge therapies and discuss the role of lifestyle changes in preventing long-term illnesses. It wasn't just that she had an impressive set of academic credentials. It was her evident compassion, warmth, and ability to set patients at ease that truly propelled her forward. When Dr. Teresa relocated to Florida, she recognized that the warm climate, vibrant communities, and the region's rising population of retirees provided a unique opportunity for a doctor who was eager to experiment with innovative healing protocols. Over time, her office became known for its bright atmosphere and its dedicated staff, all drawn together by Teresa's unwavering enthusiasm for improving her patients' quality of life. She often worked late into the evening, refusing to turn away anyone who needed guidance or reassurance, and encouraging her staff to maintain the same attitude of compassionate care. On a personal level, Teresa's closest friends noted that she was an energetic multitasker who always seemed to juggle several demanding roles simultaneously. She was a mother who relished the simple moments, driving her children to dance classes, helping them with homework assignments, or cheering them on at sporting events, while also wearing the hat of a forward-thinking physician, an entrepreneur, and a public speaker at community events. Teresa's marriage to Mark Severs added a distinct dimension to her journey. Mark, who appeared outwardly to support Teresa's practice and her aspirations, was often seen accompanying her to local fundraisers or wellness seminars. To casual observers, their relationship looked like a balanced partnership. Teresa was the driven visionary, and Mark handled many logistical or behind-the-scenes tasks that helped her practice grow. Though Mark was not formally in the medical field, he played a role in the business aspects of the clinic, sometimes assisting with administrative tasks or exploring potential opportunities to broaden her patient base. Friends of the couple recall that they displayed a comfortable dynamic, finishing each other's sentences on some occasions, and finding ways to manage the day-to-day chaos of raising a family while running a thriving practice. At the time, there was little reason to suspect anything out of the ordinary. No apparent signs of discord that would raise alarm among those closest to them. Yet, as with many successful professionals, Teresa grappled with the demands of running a busy medical practice alongside the rigors of family life. Reports from friends indicated that she sometimes felt overwhelmed by her growing patient base, the financial investments needed to keep her operation at the cutting edge, and the inevitable stressors that come with parenting. Still, her passion never appeared to wane. Rather, these challenges seemed to fuel her desire to break new ground. She dreamed of opening additional clinics or partnering with other healthcare specialists to develop a network of integrative medicine resources across Florida and beyond. Those around her often remarked that Teresa was on the verge of something even bigger, especially as she began planning workshops, retreats, and expanded services that might eventually reach a national audience. Beyond the boundaries of her professional life, Teresa was also deeply invested in her community. She engaged with local charities, initiated donation drives, and regularly participated in events aimed at supporting underprivileged families. For Teresa, giving back was not an obligation, but a privilege, an extension of the same principles that guided her medical practice. Over time, she became something of a local figure, respected not just for her medical innovations, but also for her willingness to shoulder the burdens of those who struggled. Patients trusted her, and community members leaned on her for both physical treatment and emotional encouragement. It was against this backdrop of apparent harmony and growing success that a subtle tension began to form, though almost no one in Bonita Springs recognized it at the time. Life, as it often does, became more complex behind closed doors. Whether that complexity stemmed from financial pressures, personal disagreements, or hidden aspects of individual personalities, it remained largely invisible to the outside world. On the surface, Teresa's career was flourishing, and her family's life seemed poised to continue on a bright path. She frequently mentioned new projects in the works, discussing cutting-edge treatments or collaborations that would elevate her practice to the next level. In casual conversation, she seemed optimistic about her future and confident in her ability to balance all her responsibilities. She was still the go-to doctor, the vibrant neighbor, and a mother who took pride in the achievements of her children. Little did anyone suspect how soon the public's perception would be shattered, replaced by a sense of deep tragedy and countless unanswered questions. On Sunday, June 28th, the summer sun in Bonita Springs seemed to shine a little brighter than usual, casting its warm glow over manicured lawns and busy local shops. In many ways, this day was supposed to be routine for Dr. Teresa Ann Severs, too. She had recently returned from a brief trip up north, where part of her extended family still resided. Because of overlapping work schedules, the plan had been for her husband and 2 young daughters to stay behind for a few extra days, enjoying time with relatives, while Teresa got back to her busy medical practice. She had set foot in Florida late on Sunday, confident that her empty house would offer a peaceful transition from travel fatigue to the responsibilities awaiting her at her clinic the next morning. When Teresa walked into her comfortable, well-kept home, there must have been a moment of relief. Despite her tireless energy, she was only human, and an empty house can sometimes be the perfect environment for a brief moment of calm. At some point, she set down her luggage, perhaps checked for any mail that had piled up, and reviewed her schedule for the coming week. But as the warm Florida evening surrendered to the deeper hush of night, something indescribably dark, something no one who knew her would ever have imagined, manifested within those walls. By the time the sun rose the next day, Dr. Teresa Severs' home had shifted from a sanctuary of family life to a place of incomprehensible tragedy. On Monday morning, June 29, concern began to bubble when Teresa failed to appear at her medical practice. Ordinarily, she was the first to arrive, unlocking the office, reviewing patient notes, and delegating tasks to her dedicated staff. Colleagues described her as someone who never missed a day of work without notifying the team in advance. Patients who were scheduled for early appointments found themselves waiting in a quiet lobby, exchanging puzzled glances. Some assumed there had been a scheduling error. Others speculated that Dr. Teresa might have been delayed by flight issues or unexpected traffic. Yet as minutes turned into an hour, the uneasy feeling grew stronger. The clinic staff attempted to reach Teresa by phone, expecting to hear at least a quick message or an apology for being late. No calls were returned. This was deeply uncharacteristic of a physician known for her meticulous planning and her unwavering commitment to every individual on her patient roster. Shortly thereafter, one of Teresa's close friends, who also happened to be a colleague, opted to check on her at home. The initial drive to Teresa's house was made in a spirit of concern more than alarm. Maybe she had overslept, the friend reasoned, or perhaps she was feeling unwell after the trip. That brief drive, weaving through Bonita Springs' peaceful residential areas, would ultimately deliver one of the most jarring experiences this person would ever face. Upon arrival at the Severs residence, everything was clear from the outside. No broken windows, no open doors, no immediate signs of what had happened. The front yard, as well kept as ever, offered no clue about the horror that lay inside. And yet, the friend found the house uncharacteristically quiet, with blinds half drawn, giving the impression of an eerily still environment. With a mix of trepidation and determination, the friend used a spare key, or possibly retrieved one from a hidden spot Teresa had often relied upon, to let herself inside. Instantly, an unsettling hush engulfed her. She called out for Teresa, expecting an apologetic response, but no answer came. It is difficult to encapsulate the exact blend of dread and disbelief that must have coursed through that friend's mind as she made her way through the entryway. At that point, the concerned colleague spotted signs of a disturbance. Though the house was not ransacked in the way one might expect from a typical break-in, details seemed slightly off, forming an overall impression that something had gone very wrong. Finally, she discovered Teresa's lifeless body. The specifics of that moment would haunt her for the rest of her life. Perhaps the most terrifying realization was that such a horrific event had taken place in an environment that appeared mostly intact. There was no shattered glass from forced entry, no rummaging indicative of a typical robbery. It made the scene feel chillingly personal, as though someone who knew the house. Trying to maintain some measure of composure, the friend called 911, her voice trembling with shock and disbelief. Within minutes, law enforcement descended upon the residence. They arrived to a tragic tableau. A successful physician, a beloved neighbor, now the victim of a suspicious death that warranted an immediate and thorough investigation. As deputies from the Lee County Sheriff's Office began canvassing the crime scene, they meticulously documented every inch of the house, photographing, collecting samples, and searching for the slightest clue that might point toward a suspect or reveal a motive. Almost immediately, Teresa's network of friends, colleagues, and neighbors caught wind of the tragedy. By midday, hushed conversations, text messages, and phone calls were circulating. "Have you heard?" one neighbor asked another. "Something has happened at Teresa Severs' house." The local rumor mill, typically filled with idle chatter about weekend plans or upcoming homeowners association meetings, transformed overnight. According to acquaintances, Mark's voice trembled as he tried to make sense of the news. His wife, the woman who tirelessly worked to better the lives of her patients, was suddenly gone under circumstances too horrifying to comprehend. Within hours, Mark would be on an urgent flight back to Florida to face a scene none of them could have anticipated. The arrival of local news outlets at the scene further amplified the tension. Microphones and cameras appeared along the street, capturing images of the crime scene tape fluttering in the breeze and the somber faces of law enforcement officials who refrained from commenting on any specifics. The formal announcements offered scant details. An active investigation was underway, foul play was suspected, and the sheriff's office was asking for patience while their team collected facts. Yet for a town so unaccustomed to such chilling events, the thirst for more information became palpable. Rumors began swirling, from wild theories about a random break-in to whispered speculation of a professional grudge. Every new piece of information, or even unverified hearsay, seemed to spread in an instant, intensifying a community-wide sense of fear and vulnerability. In the immediate aftermath of Dr. Teresa Severs' shocking death, law enforcement officials in Lee County found themselves grappling with a bewildering puzzle. By all initial accounts, Teresa had no known enemies, no open disputes that might explain such a violent act. Yet the brutality of the crime, coupled with the unusual lack of ransacking in her home, strongly suggested that the act had been deliberate, perhaps even planned in advance. Investigators realized they would need to dissect every facet of Teresa's life if they hoped to uncover a clue that would lead to a meaningful suspect. That painstaking effort would require sifting through financial records, analyzing digital footprints, and conducting interviews with anyone who might have had access to Teresa or knowledge of her routines. It was a daunting endeavor, and the magnitude of the task became clear as soon as detectives started mapping out Teresa's final 48 hours. They interviewed flight attendants, cab drivers, and anyone else who might have come into contact with her during her return from Connecticut. They examined phone records to see if her calls or text messages in that time frame hinted at any escalating conflict. They spoke with neighbors who had observed her arrival home, though most reported seeing little more than Teresa pulling into her driveway around sunset. At first, these lines of inquiry turned up few leads. No neighbor had noticed an unusual vehicle parked on her street, and no security camera captured a suspicious figure lurking around her property. If there was a killer in the vicinity, he or she had moved with unsettling stealth. Even so, the investigators' instincts told them that the killer was no random interloper. The initial crime scene assessment had uncovered subtle indicators that a premeditated plan might be at play. For example, certain doors showed no evidence of forced entry, and a few cameras from nearby businesses suggested that traffic on Teresa's street had been remarkably quiet that night. That sense of calculation set detectives on a path of deeper scrutiny. They began the laborious process of reconstructing Teresa's personal and professional life. Every appointment, every phone call, every personal relationship. As the investigators dug, they discovered a telling detail that ultimately became a catalyst for the entire inquiry. Teresa Severs had a robust digital presence. She used emails and text messages to stay in constant communication with her clinic staff and sometimes even with her patients who had urgent questions. Additionally, she managed her schedule electronically and kept notes on various upcoming business opportunities. With warrants in hand, they seized Teresa's home computer, her work laptop, and any mobile devices she had used. Forensic analysts combed through thousands of messages, cross-referencing names, dates, and subject lines in a quest for any sign of friction or threat. Soon, however, a new line of inquiry emerged from a surprising source: digital footprints tied to cell phone records from out of state. A detective assigned to review phone data was struck by unusual communications around the time of Teresa's murder. These communications originated from numbers not local to Florida. They seemed to trace back to individuals in Missouri. Yet after examining the logs more closely, he noticed calls and text messages that spiked in frequency leading up to the end of June. Even more telling were the location pings of these phones in the days around Teresa's murder. Though the owner of the phone was purportedly in Missouri, the data indicated that the device was traveling south, passing through multiple states, and ultimately winding up in Florida around the critical time window. Pursuing this lead, investigators made contact with law enforcement agencies in Missouri, sharing details about the case and asking for assistance in identifying the individuals behind those suspicious phone numbers. Their counterparts cross-checked local databases and discovered names that triggered deeper scrutiny. Curtis Wayne Wright, often referred to simply as Wayne, and Jimmy Ray Rogers. The next step involved determining whether these men had a legitimate reason to be in Florida, let alone in Bonita Springs near Teresa Severs' home. As investigators dug deeper, they learned that Wayne Wright had a connection to Mark Severs, which in itself was not necessarily incriminating. How likely was it that a friend from out of state happened to be in town, unbeknownst to anyone, at the exact moment a heinous crime took place? Adding to the intrigue were phone records showing that Wright and Rogers seemed to be traveling together. Their devices, at least as reflected in cell tower pings, moved in tandem southward, lingered in Florida, and then headed back north. Investigators hypothesized that if they had come to Florida for a harmless visit, they likely would have been more open about their arrival or made contact with known acquaintances. Yet to the best of anyone's knowledge, Wayne Wright's name did not surface in the immediate circle of Florida residents interviewed after Teresa's murder, beyond the mention that he was an old friend of Mark. This incongruity, paired with the suspicious timing and the patterns in phone usage, fueled a sense that these two men might be far more than casual visitors. Nevertheless, the investigators needed more than pings on a map to secure an arrest. Cell phone records alone might not convince a court that these individuals had anything to do with Teresa's death. So, they redoubled their efforts. Law enforcement in both Florida and Missouri stepped up their game, digging through digital footprints, examining financial records, and identifying any acquaintances who might have seen or interacted with Wright and Rogers during their travels. The leads began to multiply. A clerk at a convenience store in rural Missouri recalled that a pair of men, fitting approximate descriptions, had purchased snacks and fuel shortly before heading south. Security camera footage from highways and rest stops eventually confirmed that the men's car was moving toward Florida. Then, camera logs from selected Florida highways placed them in the southern part of the state, suspiciously close to Bonita Springs, at a time that matched up with the window of Teresa's murder. As word of these investigative breakthroughs circulated among law enforcement, so too did the determination to bring the suspects in for questioning. The challenge lay in figuring out where they were. Rogers was known to drift between jobs, while Wright had a somewhat more stationary life. But he too had grown elusive since news of Teresa's murder reached the public domain. Detectives worried that if the men realized the police were onto them, they might destroy potential evidence, vanish entirely, or attempt to construct alibis. Careful coordination between agencies was crucial. Behind the scenes, forensic teams pushed forward with analyzing every thread of evidence retrieved from Teresa's home. One item that garnered special attention was the kitchen flooring and the area around it, where technicians used specialized chemicals to detect latent footprints or shoe impressions invisible to the naked eye. Another area of focus was the front door and any secondary access points. Had someone unlocked a side door or used a security code to disarm a system? If so, how might they have acquired that code? Another question lingered. Were there phone calls placed or messages sent from Teresa's own devices in the final hours of her life that might have signaled fear or recognized a visitor at the door? The deeper investigators delved, the more they were convinced this was not a spontaneous act. The killer, or killers, had orchestrated events to ensure Teresa would be alone and unsuspecting. Eventually, the convergence of digital proof and real-world observations reached a tipping point. Authorities in Missouri pinpointed the whereabouts of both Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers. Rather than risking a dramatic confrontation, law enforcement planned a meticulous approach to bringing them in, hoping to secure arrests simultaneously so neither suspect had time to warn the other or flee. Surveillance teams kept tabs on the men, noting their movements to ascertain the safest and most strategic window for apprehension. Within days, deputies swooped in a separate location to execute arrests. Wright and Rogers were taken into custody. After arresting Curtis Wayne Wright and Jimmy Ray Rogers in connection with Dr. Teresa Severs' murder, law enforcement in Florida and Missouri found themselves standing at the threshold of a far more complex puzzle. From the outset, investigators had acknowledged the possibility that these men might not have acted on their own. Traveling such a great distance to commit a murder in a seemingly random Florida home was peculiar at best and suspicious in the extreme. As the authorities dug deeper, multiple strands of evidence began to converge on a theory that stunned many in the community. Mark Severs, Teresa's husband, might have all orchestrated. The official shift from viewing Mark as a grieving spouse to a potential suspect was no abrupt pivot. Rather, it arose from a methodical and painstaking accumulation of facts that, one by one, pointed to an unsettling explanation for how the murder had come to pass. Detectives started with the obvious: motive. For instance, Mark had appeared cooperative yet oddly calm during his earliest police interviews. This, in itself, is not definitive proof of wrongdoing. People process grief in different ways. But investigators noticed inconsistencies in his account of finances, marital harmony, and future plans. To gain clarity, they scrutinized the Severs family's financial situation. That probe brought to light a vital piece of information. Teresa Severs had a sizable life insurance policy. In fact, she had multiple policies that collectively were worth a substantial sum. Enough, in theory, to draw the attention of investigators looking for potential financial motives. One of the first breakthroughs came from analyzing phone records and text messages linking Mark Severs with Curtis Wayne Wright. While Mark had not hidden his friendship with Wright, claiming they had been close for years, the specific tenor of their communications became a point of contention. In the months leading up to Teresa's murder, the frequency of calls and text messages between the two men had increased notably. Some messages were innocuous, casual chatter about day-to-day life and old memories they shared. Others, though less direct, contained cryptic references that investigators believed might be code or carefully worded phrases pointing to a darker agenda. When Mark was asked to explain the contents of these communications, he attributed them to typical banter, occasionally mixing in the claim that Wright was helping with certain business matters. Meanwhile, newly discovered evidence also hinted at undercurrents of marital tension. Several of Teresa's close confidants revealed that the couple's relationship, while outwardly stable, had endured a series of strains, financial disagreements. She had mentioned wanting to expand her practice, possibly open additional locations, and invest in specialized equipment. Mark, on the other hand, had grown increasingly concerned about the family's financial stability. Against this background, law enforcement returned to the confessions, or lack thereof, by Wright and Rogers. Publicly, the two men continued to deny direct involvement or maintained versions of events that contradicted each other. Underneath that surface, however, prosecutors hoped that pressure and the looming threat of severe punishment might compel at least one suspect to strike a deal. It was a standard strategy in major homicide cases. If you suspect a conspiracy, one party might be induced to testify against the others in exchange for a more lenient sentence. Detectives arranged repeated interviews with Wright, sensing that his link to Mark Severs ran deeper than Rogers did. They questioned him about timelines, phone records, and the suspicious journey from Missouri to Florida. For a time, Wayne Wright offered only half answers, disclaimers, or carefully curated statements that skirted the truth. The turning point arose when a plea agreement became a real possibility. The state's prosecutorial team, determined to hold everyone involved accountable, approached Curtis Wayne Wright with a proposition: reveal the entire truth and testify in court in exchange for a second-degree murder charge or some measure of leniency. After lengthy and complex negotiations, Wayne Wright took a plea deal, admitted guilt to second-degree murder, and was sentenced to 25 years in prison. Once the agreement was in place, Wright's story unfurled in jaw-dropping detail. According to Wright's account, the plan began forming months before Teresa's murder. Mark, frustrated by a variety of personal and financial pressures, allegedly confided in Wright about his marital woes, hinting that divorce was impossible or undesirable for personal reasons. Over numerous phone calls and text messages, Mark is said to have tested the waters. He lamented that if something ever happened to Teresa, the life insurance payouts would rescue him from financial calamity and spare him from further marital discord. At first, Wright claimed he had tried to dissuade Mark from such a dark line of thought, but eventually, the conversation turned more concrete. Discussions about timing, method, and how to ensure that Teresa was alone. Wright further alleged that Mark was adamant the murder appears as a random burglary or a crime of opportunity, an act that would draw minimal suspicion toward him. Wright, in turn, recruited Jimmy Rogers. The two men then meticulously planned their trip from Missouri to Florida. Investigators, armed with Wright's statements, now had a narrative in which Mark Severs emerged not merely as a possible suspect, but as the alleged ringleader. Yet they were mindful that a confession from a co-defendant, especially one who benefits from a plea deal, by itself can be insufficient to secure conviction. Someone in Wright's position might lie or exaggerate to shift blame, lessen his own culpability, or secure the best possible plea bargain. Therefore, the task before investigators became verifying that the details of Wright's confession matched independent evidence. They meticulously cross-referenced phone records, flight itineraries, surveillance footage, text messages, financial statements, and the testimonies of others. The deeper they dug, the more certain parallels emerged. The times that Mark and Wright spoke aligned disturbingly well with key events leading up to and immediately after Teresa's murder. Credit card receipts from Missouri to Florida also corroborated part of Wright's story. A separate dimension of the case involved Mark Severs' behavior once Teresa's murder had become national news. Investigators noted that he made numerous calls to insurance companies shortly after his wife's death, inquiring about claim payouts and the required paperwork. As the case against Mark solidified, detectives contemplated the best moment to make an arrest. They had to move carefully. The last thing they wanted was to tip Mark off or give him an opportunity to flee or destroy evidence. Finally, once Wayne Wright's testimony had been thoroughly documented and cross-referenced, and as ballistic, forensic, and digital data corroborated substantial elements of his confession, investigators felt they had enough to make their move. Local authorities coordinated with their Missouri counterparts, but the main target was now in Florida: Mark Severs himself. In the morning, members of the Lee County Sheriff's Office and other specialized units quietly positioned themselves around Mark's residence, ensuring that if he tried to escape, he would be quickly taken into custody. Then, with arrest warrant in hand, they knocked on his door. The official charge read first-degree murder, along with conspiracy to commit murder, highlighting the planned and intentional nature of the crime. Prosecutors moved swiftly to craft their arguments, referencing the life insurance policies, the phone logs, the suspicious timing of Mark's communications with Wright and Rogers, and the newly minted testimonial from Wayne Wright. Mark, on the advice of legal counsel, maintained his innocence, insisting that he had been the victim of misguided accusations. As Mark awaited trial, public sentiment vacillates between shock, anger, and a small contingent of skeptics who still couldn't accept the notion that the husband was behind it all. The trial of Mark Severs and his alleged co-conspirators soon developed into a monumental legal drama that captured Florida's attention and drew national media interest. Jimmy Ray Rogers' trial was up first in a packed courtroom under tight security. After lengthy deliberations, the jury returned a guilty verdict. He was convicted of second-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison. With Rogers now convicted, public attention pivoted squarely to Mark Severs, the figure at the heart of an alleged conspiracy. The main pillar of the state's case rested on testimony from Curtis Wayne Wright, who had pled guilty to second-degree murder under a deal guaranteeing a reduced sentence in exchange for honest, comprehensive disclosure of the plot's every detail. The jury, having already seen one conviction for a participant in the murder, was primed to view Mark's entanglement with deep suspicion. After multiple weeks of arguments, witness testimonies, and forensic exposés, both sides presented their closing statements. Prosecutors urged the jury to consider the totality of evidence, reminding them that a case need not contain a dramatic confession recorded on tape to be conclusive. Ultimately, it took the jury substantial deliberation before they returned to the courtroom, faces somber, with a verdict in hand. The judge read the decision. Mark Severs was found guilty of first-degree murder and conspiracy to commit murder. When the bailiffs led Mark away, cameras captured a man who, moments earlier, had been an ordinary Floridian husband, now condemned as a murderer. In the weeks and months that followed, he would seek appeal, but the immediate legal endpoint was clear. Mark Severs was sentenced to death. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began its methodical procedure: secure the site and collect every possible clue to explain how a bright young future had been so abruptly shattered. One detective later described entering the apartment and sensing a grim weight in the air, an impression that this was far more than a momentary burst of anger. The presence of certain injuries indicated resistance, that Ayana had fought back at some stage. This, in turn, contradicted any theory of a simple accident or fleeting moment of anger. The nature and extent of the violence hinted at something premeditated, or at least escalated beyond what could be explained by provocation. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Los Angeles has long been a city of reinvention, drawing dreamers and strivers from every corner of the globe. Beneath the famous Hollywood sign and amidst the bustling streets, countless newcomers hope to carve out their own success stories. Against this glittering backdrop of sun-soaked boulevards and towering palm trees, a young woman named Iana Casan arrived with aspirations that stretched far beyond the ordinary. Born on February 27, 1986 in Ukraine, Iana Casan has always been distinguished by her exceptional determination. She studied law with a fierce dedication, hoping to help those in need and make a name for herself in a world where justice and fairness often seemed elusive. She was the kind of person who believed in thorough preparation, in analyzing every angle before making decisions that might alter the course of her life. That sense of responsibility guided her throughout her studies and eventually propelled her across the globe, where she chose to start anew in the United States, a place she had only ever seen on television or read about in magazines. From an early stage, Ayana harbored a belief that a successful life could be built on an intersection of determination, kindness, and strategic planning. She learned English diligently, often watching subtitled movies and practicing pronunciation until she felt comfortable initiating casual conversations in her non-native tongue. This was no small feat, as each syllable carried with it a sense of possibility and a step closer to her goal of making a meaningful life abroad. When she finally touched down at LAX, she was not just a tourist enamored with the city's iconic landmarks, but an ambitious newcomer ready to roll up her sleeves. Although her early days in Los Angeles were spent acquainting herself with the local courts and volunteer organizations, Iana soon realized that establishing a professional foothold in a foreign legal system demanded resilience and resourcefulness. She attended workshops, explored opportunities in translation services, and networked with other immigrant communities that understood the hurdles of adapting to an entirely new environment. Through these interactions, Iana discovered a supportive circle that marveled at her optimistic disposition and straightforward sense of purpose. Despite the challenges, she saw potential everywhere. The city was as vibrant as it was daunting, and that duality invigorated her. Always meticulous, she balanced her finances on a tight budget, dedicating her off hours to studying California's laws and reading about the state's legal precedents. She reminded herself that all worthwhile goals demanded patience and that her journey had only just begun. As Iana's social circle gradually expanded, she was introduced to new acquaintances who recognized her warmth and sincerity. Among them were individuals operating in various fields, some in entertainment, some in the tech sector, and a few who dabbled in creative industries. Through a friend of a friend, she met Blake, a Canadian who came from a prominent family and carried himself with a kind of casual confidence that can be both appealing and intimidating. Rumors circulated that he had ties to wealthy circles back home, but Blake rarely flaunted that aspect of his life, preferring to talk about projects he was involved in: writing, art, even the possibility of working on a screenplay. He was the kind of person who charmed people with grand, sweeping ideas about what could be accomplished with the right mixture of passion and financial backing. To some, these were enthralling possibilities. To others, they were half-baked fantasies. Whatever the truth, there was something about Blake's optimism that resonated with Iana. Perhaps it was because they both nurtured big dreams, or maybe it was her habit of believing in the best qualities of people before passing judgment. She found herself drawn into Blake's world, a sphere that was altogether different from her legally oriented mindset. He spoke of art and storytelling as though they were living entities, conjuring images of bold narratives and striking visuals. At first, Iana thought his passion was refreshing. It reflected an unexpected synergy. While she valued structure and verifiable facts, Blake was more at ease navigating the fluid realm of imagination. Their budding friendship was further cemented by a shared curiosity about each other's backgrounds. Blake, for his part, seemed fascinated by Iana's upbringing in Eastern Europe, asking her about cultural traditions and the nuances of the Ukrainian legal system. She responded with patient, thoughtful explanations, appreciating his effort to understand her roots. Yet beneath the polished surface, Iana sometimes sensed a subtle darkness in his imagination that she couldn't fully articulate. Nevertheless, the gravitational pull of two contrasting perspectives, her devotion to order and justice, his affinity for artistic chaos, laid the foundation for an unlikely alliance. Before long, rumors of a possible romantic relationship began to surface. Friends whispered about the seemingly mismatched pair, speculating whether the relationship would last or if it was merely a passing attraction born from life in a bustling metropolis that devours fleeting connections. Still, Iana and Blake maintained their own version of normalcy. When she told him about her dream of building a career, he would nod in empathetic support, sometimes even offering to introduce her to people in his network who might help her find more meaningful work. By all accounts, Blake presented himself as a creative soul with philanthropic tendencies, a person who claimed to understand the hardships that hamper success in a competitive environment. She occasionally received calls from her relatives in Ukraine who were eager to hear about the progress she was making. Whenever she spoke of Blake during these conversations, she would highlight his imaginative side, carefully selecting positive anecdotes that showed him in a good light. For the most part, her family expressed relief that Iana had found someone who appreciated her, even if they remained understandably cautious about the uncertainties that come with cross-cultural relationships in a distant land. Yet there were moments when Iana found herself pausing to consider subtle changes in Blake's demeanor. At times, he would exhibit bursts of anxiety, and certain topics seemed to unnerve him. If she probed too deeply into his creative influences or the darkness that underpinned some of his artistic works, he would brush off the conversation or steer it elsewhere. She usually attributed this to artistic temperament, convincing herself that such behavior was not unusual for people immersed in imaginative projects. Moreover, no glaring warning signs emerged during their early interactions, no open threats or indisputable evidence of malice. Instead, their dynamic revolved around shared ambitions and the comforting notion that they could both flourish in the sprawling maze that is Los Angeles. Just as Ayana started to feel more grounded, a few of her acquaintances gently questioned the stability of her relationship with Blake. They cautioned her to remain vigilant, explaining that the city was a magnet for people with fluid personalities, some truly talented, others simply chasing illusions. An undercurrent of whispers suggested that Blake's finances and background might be more complicated than they seemed, riddled with familial expectations and unresolved tensions. Though Iana listened, she chose not to jump to negative conclusions. She was in the habit of granting people the benefit of the doubt, a habit that sometimes served her well in mediating conflicts but could also blind her to potential red flags. In that sense, Ayana was living a carefully balanced life, juggling her aspirations in law, familial responsibilities, and a growing relationship that seemed both promising and perplexing. Little did anyone suspect that beneath the surface of what appeared to be a promising partnership, harrowing secrets would one day come to light. Looking back, friends and family looked for signs they might have missed. How could something that started out so positively end in such a terrible tragedy? In the weeks leading up to the moment that would forever alter countless lives, everyday routines seemed deceptively ordinary for those who knew Ayana and Blake. Outwardly, they continued to frequent their favorite cafes, talk animatedly about their plans, and share moments of apparent normalcy with friends. However, a subtle tension had begun to infiltrate their home life. Those closest to Iana noticed that her usual confidence sometimes wavered, and she seemed reluctant to discuss certain aspects of her relationship. For all the optimism that had once defined her, there were now occasional hints of fear in her eyes. At times, she would brush off her friend's concerns with a nervous laugh, as though reluctant to delve too deeply into her private anxieties. She had always prided herself on being self-reliant and level-headed, so perhaps she thought she could manage or de-escalate whatever conflicts arose. Meanwhile, Blake, still outwardly friendly, began to show erratic behavior. He would occasionally withdraw from gatherings without explanation or respond irritably to questions about his work. Certain acquaintances who had initially admired him for his creative streak now confessed that they felt uneasy in his presence. There was no single dramatic incident to provide clarity. Rather, a series of small, disquieting developments that collectively hinted at turmoil beneath the couple's carefully maintained surface. During this period, one of Iana's close friends, who occasionally stayed in contact via late-night phone calls, recalled a specific conversation in which Ayana sounded torn. She seemed eager to discuss professional opportunities, perhaps a chance at a paralegal position with a local firm, but she hesitated to share details about her personal life. When her friend gently prodded, suggesting that perhaps Ayana needed time away from Blake, she abruptly changed the subject. In the retelling of that conversation later, the friend admitted that while she sensed Ayana's worry, she never would have imagined the harrowing events that would eventually unfold. Hindsight, of course, imparts a grim clarity that day-to-day life often disguises. Even if Iana had begun to detect that something was amiss, it is equally plausible that she believed the issues could be resolved through patience and understanding. After all, she had navigated challenges her entire life, from acclimating to a new culture in Los Angeles to financially supporting herself through a wide variety of side jobs. Why should her relationship be any different? Not long after, neighbors in the West Hollywood apartment building reported hearing sharp disagreements emanating from behind closed doors. At first, the disturbances were chalked up to typical couples' quarrels, tense enough to rattle the walls, but not so extreme as to suggest imminent danger. The building, nestled in a vibrant neighborhood, was no stranger to the clamor of everyday life. Blaring television sets, late-night parties, or impassioned arguments that tapered off with the dawn. For most residents, the occasional raised voices never inspired more than mild annoyance. Still, over time, there were instances when people who lived near Ayana and Blake mentioned hearing disturbing snippets, angry, unsteady tones, and what might have been pleas for calm. One neighbor admitted, in a hushed conversation with other tenants, that she sometimes wondered whether something sinister was brewing in the apartment across the hall. Yet, in a city as large and diverse as Los Angeles, it can be easy to assume that other people's disputes are not one's business. Speculation remained just that. Whispers of worry, easily overshadowed by the bustle of everyday obligations. Amid these growing concerns, Iana found herself increasingly isolated. Some friends noticed she was less available for casual get-togethers or group lunches. When she did appear, she looked exhausted, as though burdened by intangible worries. Uncharacteristically, she would rush home instead of lingering in conversation. In a journal entry recovered later, she had scribbled short notes to herself, reminding herself to be strong, to focus on her goals. Despite the ominous atmosphere closing in around her, she still believed in rational solutions, possibly because of her legal training and her innate inclination to see the best in people. It was that trait, her deep-seated conviction that dialogue and patience could solve almost anything, that would, in a tragic irony, contribute to her vulnerability. If friends pressed her for updates, she reassured them in a measured tone that she was doing her best to handle personal matters and that nothing warranted serious alarm. Precisely when the tension between them tipped from verbal discord to the threat of physical harm is not something that can be pinpointed with complete accuracy. What became increasingly clear is that Blake's creative musings began to intersect with a darker strain of thinking. He had apparently immersed himself in unsettling stories and artwork that, to certain observers, bordered on the macabre. Though he rarely spoke about these themes in polite company, glimpses of them surfaced in snippets of conversation, brief mentions of violent imagery in graphic novels, disturbing storyboards that took shape late at night. It was never enough to trigger immediate alarm. After all, many artists explore unsettling themes as part of their craft. But in the context of Blake's increasingly fragile emotional state, these fascinations hinted at a more disturbing undercurrent that Iana either overlooked or believed she could help him manage. The final day that friends or neighbors recall seeing Iana alive was marked by a seemingly mundane routine. She left the apartment early in the morning to pick up some groceries and returned shortly thereafter, exchanging polite nods with a tenant in the elevator. According to him, she looked unusually tense, her eyes darting toward the ceiling as though expecting an unpleasant surprise. When night fell, however, some residents reported an abrupt commotion. A single piercing cry, quickly muffled, then nothing. The hush that followed was deeply unsettling. The exact timeline of events inside that apartment remains partially obscured by conflicting statements and the chaos that followed. What is definitively known is that something dreadful transpired late into the night, culminating in a scene so disturbing that first responders would later describe it as one of the most distressing they had ever encountered. A sense of panic pervaded the small, meticulously furnished living space, suggesting that a struggle had unfolded in multiple rooms. Certain items were scattered in a way that indicated an attempt to resist or escape. The few glimpses made public in official reports alluded to signs of violence and trauma. Yet it was equally clear that Iana's final ordeal occurred with no immediate neighbors intervening or even fully comprehending the danger. That fact would later haunt many people, fueling a collective sorrow that they had not realized the severity of the threat. Only in the early hours of the following morning did concerned parties begin to mobilize. Iana's mother, who had been unable to reach her daughter by phone, made repeated attempts to call or text, growing increasingly anxious with each unanswered ring. By mid-morning, her panic escalated to the point where she reached out to one of Ayana's closest friends, urging her to check the apartment. Meanwhile, that same friend had received a baffling message from Blake's phone, its tone abrupt and vaguely dismissive. Sensing that something was seriously amiss, the friend tried to contact building management, and a decision was made to place an urgent call to the police. Officers arrived on scene shortly thereafter, but they initially faced resistance in accessing the apartment. Accounts diverge on whether Blake himself refused to open the door or whether it was simply locked and barricaded from inside. When law enforcement finally set foot in the apartment, the gravity of what they discovered confirmed their worst fears. By then, the area had been cordoned off, and additional units were deployed to secure the perimeter. The disturbing reality soon became clear. There would be no rescue, no revival, no flurry of urgent medical interventions that could alter the outcome. Iana Casan was found deceased, her body bearing evidence of a horrifying end. News of Iana's death leaked out into the community with startling speed. Within a matter of hours, texts and calls flashed from phone to phone, each person reacting with shock, confusion, or disbelief. The question on everyone's mind was how such a tragedy could have erupted behind the doors of two individuals who had, in many respects, seemed fairly ordinary, perhaps even enviable. Iana's professional dreams, her warm personality, and her willingness to help others were well known among her acquaintances. While there were inklings of trouble, few imagined that those troubles would escalate into something so devastating. Blake was taken into custody at the scene, but the details surrounding his state of mind, his explanations, or his reactions were kept tightly under wraps. The police, citing the high-profile nature of the case, restricted public statements to only the broadest of confirmations: that a homicide had occurred, that a suspect was in custody, and that the preliminary investigation strongly pointed to him as the perpetrator. Amid this frenzy, Ayana's family and friends struggled to come to terms with the loss, exchanging messages of grief and heartbreak over the abrupt end to a life that had once radiated such promise. In the days that followed, authorities provided limited official updates, stating that more information would emerge as the case progressed. They acknowledged that the victim and suspect had a history together, but they refrained from disclosing definitive motives or the precise nature of what had led to the final confrontation. Of course, rumors circulated, fueled by online speculation and neighbors recounting every snippet of noise they might have heard through the walls in the preceding weeks. For many, the immediate reaction was simply disbelief that someone as gentle, studious, and community-minded as Ayana could have been subjected to a fate so violent. As the shock subsided enough for people to reflect, certain patterns emerged in what they recalled of the couple's dynamic. While the narrative of a troubled relationship was only partially formed before the tragedy, posthumous recollections now took on added significance, with each uneasy memory or piece of anecdotal evidence magnified. Some recalled fleeting instances of control, a disapproving glance from Blake when Iana spoke too freely, or his reluctance to let her socialize without him. Others remembered that some of his artistic works bordered on violence, though they had never before made a direct connection between his creative life and any real danger. All of these threads, once woven into a tapestry of speculation, formed the underpinnings of the central question. Why would a young man from a well-to-do background, who ostensibly had every advantage, commit an act so severe? And why would such a bright, ambitious person like Iana remain in a situation that even faintly suggested peril? In the hours following the discovery of Ayana's body, waves of law enforcement officials, forensic specialists, and emergency responders converged on the West Hollywood apartment. The Los Angeles County Sheriff's Department began its methodical procedure: secure the site and collect every possible clue to explain how a bright young future had been so abruptly shattered. One detective later described entering the apartment and sensing a grim weight in the air, an impression that this was far more than a momentary burst of anger. Per standard protocol, investigators moved quickly to preserve all evidence. Crime scene photographers documented every room, each piece of furniture, and any trace of disruption. Forensic technicians followed, bagging items that might later prove crucial in reconstructing Iana's final hours. Fibers, smudges, and other minute details were gathered for lab tests. Detectives knew that the simplest imprint or overlooked stain could become essential if the suspect's account failed to align with the physical facts. They methodically labeled and stored everything with the understanding that every thread of evidence counted. Police escorted Blake to a patrol car for questioning. Onlookers noted he seemed disoriented, neither overtly resisting nor showing overt emotion. At the station, detectives began the formal interrogation process. Insiders would later mention that his statements shifted repeatedly, alternating between sorrow and evasiveness. Over hours of questioning, the inconsistencies in his version of events multiplied. Yet investigators could not rush to judgment. They were determined to cross-check each claim with the physical evidence. Facts had to be unassailable, because any error might jeopardize the case if it reached a courtroom. While that interrogation unfolded, medical examiners prepared to conduct an autopsy, a vital procedure to confirm the cause and manner of Iana's death. The final report would remain sealed for some time, but detectives were privately briefed. Their suspicions that this was more than a spontaneous altercation hardened into near certainty. Ayana's injuries indicated a profound level of violence. However, the question still loomed. What had triggered it? Seeking a fuller picture, investigators turned to Iana's friends, co-workers, and relatives. They uncovered a mosaic of perspectives. One friend described a phone call in which Ayana downplayed personal conflicts while sounding far from her usual self. Another recalled that Blake's artwork delved into disturbing territory, though few had linked it to real-life aggression. A former colleague of Blake's noted that he could be charismatic one moment, withdrawn the next. Yet no single person had foreseen this explosive tragedy. As the detective team pieced everything together, it appeared that tension had been building behind the scenes, likely unknown to all but the couple themselves. Parallel to this, investigators reviewed any potential outside motives. Could someone else have wanted to harm Iana? Or was this purely a domestic situation? Meanwhile, the painstaking gathering of evidence continued. Lab technicians compared DNA samples, tested for substances, and analyzed every fiber under microscopic scrutiny. Detectives reconstructed a timeline of Iana's final day. Her morning routine, any stops she made, and the approximate time she returned home. Security cameras from adjacent buildings were scrutinized frame by frame, capturing a few unclear glimpses but nothing definitive. Perhaps a silhouette crossing a courtyard, the distant rumble of a car's engine. Still, these bits of data, combined with phone records, painted an increasingly damning picture of who had been present when things went horribly wrong. Discrepancies in Blake's statements carried significant weight. If he said he was asleep at a certain hour but a video clip suggested someone moving about the apartment, it might indicate deception. Experienced detectives know that murder cases seldom hinge on a single dramatic gotcha moment. Instead, they revolve around a meticulous web of confirmations and contradictions. Here, each piece of forensic evidence formed a link in the chain that was steadily encircling the suspect's account. Seasoned detectives recognized a narrative pattern they had encountered before, though no two cases are identical. A relationship that appeared outwardly stable but was undercut by tension, culminating in violence that outsiders rarely predict. While sensational headlines focused on Blake's purported wealth or the darkness in some of his graphic writings, investigators focused on verifying facts and motivations. They gathered any notes, text messages, or emails that might illuminate the couple's dynamic. Days turned into weeks, then months, as experts pored over the most minute evidence. Investigators had one goal above all else: ensure that when charges were brought, the case would stand on an unshakable foundation. As the forensic data trickled back, it confirmed key suspicions. The presence of certain injuries indicated resistance, that Ayana had fought back at some stage. This, in turn, contradicted any theory of a simple accident or fleeting moment of anger. The nature and extent of the violence hinted at something premeditated, or at least escalated beyond what could be explained by provocation. Step by step, the lead detective prepared the case file for the district attorney's office. The file was massive, stacked with transcripts of witness statements, forensic lab results, and lengthy investigative notes. Each item was carefully cross-referenced with timelines and diagrams, ensuring that no detail would be overlooked. They understood that a drawn-out trial could be inevitable. Blake's defense would likely challenge everything from the validity of DNA testing to the interpretation of Iana's injuries. Eventually, the official charges were filed: murder in the first degree, among additional counts that reflected the severity of the assault. When the trial date finally arrived, the courtroom in downtown Los Angeles became a focal point for reporters, legal observers, and community members still reeling from the horrendous details of Iana Casan's death. Before the jury, the prosecutors presented itemized evidence meticulously gathered during the investigation. Evidence logs detailed the exact locations of fibers, the significance of bloodstain patterns, and the presence of injuries strongly suggesting that Ayana had fought for her life. The state's forensic experts testified that the marks found around the scene were consistent with a struggle extending well beyond a single flash of anger. Crucially, the prosecutors delved into the timeline. They asserted that phone records showed Ayana had made her last text to a friend earlier in the evening, mentioning that she felt uneasy, but insisting she would handle the situation. Testimony about video footage from neighboring buildings was also introduced. While the footage had not captured a perfectly clear sequence of events, it recorded that no one else had entered or exited the complex in the critical time frame. According to the state, this left only one possible suspect. Though the defense would later question whether the footage was conclusive, the prosecution used it to bolster the argument that no third party could have carried out the crime, then vanished without a trace. Another critical component of the state's case involved the psychological underpinnings that could motivate such brutality. While they did not dwell on sensationalized depictions of Blake's art or writing, the prosecutors did note that some of his creative projects contained extreme themes, overlapping with violent imagery. They called on an expert who carefully explained that while dark artistic expression alone does not prove intent to kill, it can signal a mindset more receptive to aggression, especially when combined with other risk factors, such as emotional instability or erratic behavior. The expert never outright stated that reading or writing about violence precipitates homicide. Rather, they framed it as one potential element among many that might shape a suspect's worldview. Combined with the ample physical evidence, the prosecution argued that these details formed a mosaic of premeditated malice. When the defense took the floor, a starkly different narrative emerged. Their opening statement acknowledged the horror of Iana's death, but claimed that Blake's involvement was not as unequivocal as the state alleged. They implied that perhaps an unknown assailant had entered the apartment, capitalizing on what they described as a volatile but not murderous environment. Alternatively, they floated the possibility that an unforeseen confrontation spiraled out of control in a moment of emotional duress. The defense pointed to the absence of eyewitnesses who could definitively say they saw Blake commit the act. Experts for the defense came forward to argue alternate theories about the evidence. They attempted to interpret certain blood spatter patterns as inconclusive, rather than definitive proof of an extended struggle. They also questioned the reliability of some forms of forensic testing, noting that human error in labs is not unheard of. Yet these arguments often faltered against the prosecution's robust accumulation of cross-reference data. For instance, if one piece of evidence could be contested, another would underscore the same conclusion. It became increasingly clear that the defense struggled to neutralize the totality of findings that consistently pointed toward one possible scenario: that Iana's final moments had been shaped by a single attacker whose identity was difficult to deny. Midway through the trial, the tone shifted as the prosecution called on Iana's close friends and relatives. Their testimonies introduced a powerful emotional current in the courtroom. Blake himself took the stand late in the trial, a choice many observers found surprising, as defense attorneys often prefer to shield their client from the risks of cross-examination. Appearing composed yet somber, he claimed that he had loved Iana and had never intended to harm her. He offered vague explanations for the inconsistencies in his earlier statements, attributing them to panic, confusion, and shock at discovering her lifeless body. At one point, he broke down in tears, insisting that he had simply lost his memory of the crucial time frame due to stress or trauma. The cross-examination by the prosecution was relentless, as they presented each contradictory element from his interrogations and evidence from the crime scene, asking him directly to account for each discrepancy. More than once, he stumbled over an explanation, appearing cornered by the sheer mass of physical clues that contradicted his versions of events. By the end of his testimony, some courtroom observers remarked that his display of emotion, whether genuine or contrived, lacked the consistency needed to sway the jury. Finally, the jury retired and spent 2 full days reviewing documents, asking for clarification on certain pieces of evidence, and reviewing transcripts of key testimony. On the 3rd day, the bailiff announced that a verdict had been reached. The jury returned to their seats and read aloud the verdict. Blake Liebel was guilty of first-degree murder. At the formal sentencing hearing a few weeks later, the judge noted the brutality of the crime and the apparent lack of remorse. Based on the weight of the evidence and the unanimous verdict of the jury, the court rendered its final verdict: life in prison without the possibility of parole. On September 19, search crews scouring the rugged terrain near Wyoming's Grand Teton National Park made a discovery. The FBI quickly took over the scene, sealing off the area with a wide perimeter and bringing in a team of forensic experts to meticulously examine every inch of the site. Park rangers, well-versed in the terrain, assisted by identifying paths commonly used by hikers and off-road vehicles, attempting to reconstruct the final steps that led to this secluded spot. As the hours wore on and the scope of the investigation grew, the mood shifted from hopeful to heartbreaking. This was no longer a search and rescue mission. A few days later, the devastating news was confirmed. It was Gabby Petito. For her parents, it was the confirmation of their worst fears. Dear viewers, please don't forget to like, leave a comment under the video, and subscribe to the channel so as not to miss new videos. This is very important to us. Today, we're diving into a real-life crime case, the tragic story of Gabby Petito. We'll go through the photos and details of what really happened. Gabby Petito was born on March 19, 1999, in Blue Point, New York, located on Long Island in the United States. Gabby grew up in a modest but close-knit family that valued togetherness, long drives, and sharing stories around the dinner table. From an early age, she developed a sense of curiosity and wanderlust that often led her to dream of new horizons, wide-open roads, and national parks untouched by time. Friends recall that she would spend nights watching travel documentaries, scribbling down ideas in a notebook about places she hoped to visit when she had the means and the time. By her late teens, Gabby had started researching travel routes with astonishing precision. She was methodical yet flexible, caring about the practicalities, like budgeting for campsites and gas money, while also leaving enough room for spontaneous detours. After graduating from school, she embraced part-time jobs that gave her a chance to save a bit, all with the ultimate goal of breaking away from the routine to see new places, meet new faces, and document the entire experience in her own creative way. It was during these formative years that she crossed paths with Brian Laundrie. He appeared to share a similar passion for stepping off the beaten path. Their acquaintances say they bonded over hiking trips in local forests, swapping stories about survival skills, and the thrilling idea of packing life into a van and taking off to discover hidden corners of America. As time went by, Gabby and Brian's bond grew stronger, and they became determined to make their dream of full-time traveling a reality. They started following popular nomadic vloggers on social platforms, learning how to convert vans into micro-homes on wheels. Their evenings were spent watching tutorials on insulating vehicle interiors, installing solar panels for off-grid power, and configuring every inch of space to store supplies efficiently. When they finally found a used van that met their budget, they threw themselves into the project. Brian took on the more hands-on mechanical tasks, while Gabby documented their progress on her social media, using short videos and photos to celebrate each step. They transformed the empty shell into a tiny home with a fold-out bed, small storage compartments, and enough room for basic cooking necessities. Their families viewed the relationship with cautious optimism. On one hand, there was an undeniable spark between Gabby and Brian, and it was hard not to admire their dedication to their plan. They were young, energetic, and seemed to have found a constructive way to channel their restlessness. On the other hand, neither family could entirely dispel the natural parental concern that arose from knowing their children intended to traverse thousands of miles through unfamiliar territory, often with limited connectivity. Gabby's parents, particularly, wanted reassurance about safety measures. They asked about emergency funds, reliable phone plans, and how the pair intended to navigate potential hazards like unpredictable weather or mechanical breakdowns. Gabby promised them she would stay in touch regularly, sending photos and location updates, and that they would carry emergency supplies in case they needed help in remote areas. Although the families granted their blessings, there lingered an undercurrent of unease that perhaps such an ambitious plan required even more careful preparation. In the months leading up to their departure, Gabby's excitement grew to a fever pitch. Despite the outward serenity of their aspirations, there were rumors of subtle disagreements beneath the surface. Mutual acquaintances observed occasional friction in their interactions. Nothing overtly alarming, but small moments of tension that hinted at conflicting viewpoints. Brian would sometimes express frustration about the pressures of constant filming, hinting that documenting every moment for online audiences might detract from the genuine experience of traveling. Gabby, ever eager to share her story with a growing audience, insisted that their footage could become more than mere vacation videos. Leading up to their departure, they began to acquire the final items on their checklist: camping stoves, water purifiers, backpacks tailored for day hikes, and all sorts of camera equipment. Friends organized a small farewell gathering shortly before the official launch of the trip. Held in a local park, the send-off was a potluck where everyone brought favorite dishes and took turns offering advice or funny anecdotes about life on the road. Gabby glowed with excitement, hugging everyone and promising to check in whenever she had cell service. Brian was more subdued, but wore a contented smile as he chatted with a few close friends about the nuts and bolts of the van's mechanical upgrades. One friend noticed that Brian seemed slightly on edge, though it was easy to attribute this to pre-trip jitters. After all, leaving behind the familiarity of one's hometown for an extended, open-ended journey is a daunting step. Finally, the day came to set out on the road. They had planned their departure at dawn, believing it symbolic to start this transformative chapter at first light. As the van pulled away, there was a general sense of relief mixed with excitement. Relief that the months of preparation had culminated in a real beginning, and excitement for what was yet to come. In late August, when Gabby's usual flurry of updates began to dwindle, her family initially dismissed the silence as a natural side effect of traveling in remote areas. They expected the occasional gap in contact, figuring she and Brian might be hiking through canyons with spotty reception or camping in national parks where cell signals were notoriously unreliable. But as the days ticked by without so much as a quick text, a sliver of unease began to grow. Her parents attempted to reach her through calls, social media messages, and every possible digital avenue they had, but all went unanswered. At first, it felt like a matter of poor timing. They imagined that maybe Gabby had set her phone aside to fully savor the experience of life on the road. However, the silence persisted, and a creeping sense of anxiety took hold. A few friends encouraged the family to stay calm, reminding them that sporadic communication could be part of van travel, especially if Gabby and Brian had chosen campsites far from civilization. Yet with every passing hour, that comforting logic felt thinner and thinner, overshadowed by a gnawing fear that something was fundamentally wrong. Gabby's mother, who had become accustomed to receiving at least a short daily text. She scoured Gabby's online pages, rereading her most recent travel notes and scouring the comments for any mention of unusual behavior or changes in itinerary. The final update from Gabby was an unremarkable snapshot showcasing a rocky landscape and a bright sky. Texts to Brian also went unanswered. While Brian had never been as active online as Gabby, he would occasionally respond to short inquiries from family. This time, nothing. It was as if both travelers had stepped beyond the digital map, leaving no trail behind. As the silence stretched on, Gabby's parents grew even more worried. They debated whether to alert the authorities right away or wait a few more days in case the couple was simply in a communications dead zone. Ultimately, they decided to notify the police on September 11th, firmly believing that waiting any longer could prove disastrous if Gabby was indeed in trouble. Within hours, local law enforcement recognized the seriousness of the situation and initiated a missing person report. Investigators tried to reconstruct Gabby's last known movements, calling on campgrounds, ranger stations, and local police departments in areas the couple had planned to visit. Their objective was to determine an approximate timeline for when Gabby was last physically seen or heard from, by anyone. All the while, her parents clung to the hope that perhaps Gabby and Brian had simply had a falling out that led Gabby to isolate herself for a while. Even in that scenario, though, it was deeply out of character for her to vanish without a single word. Then came an unsettling twist. Brian turned up back in Florida on September 1, alone, driving the very van that he and Gabby had shared. There was no public explanation as to why Gabby wasn't with him, nor any immediate statement about whether they had parted ways. Neighbors and friends tried to piece together a logical reason for his abrupt homecoming, yet the puzzle remained incomplete. Instead of clarifying the situation, Brian kept to himself. When law enforcement approached him for information, he refused to cooperate, directing all inquiries through legal representation. This baffled everyone who knew the couple. Why wouldn't Brian want to assist in finding Gabby if she was truly missing? Gabby's family found his silence particularly distressing, especially given that he was the last known person to see her. The police press conferences around this time were marked by a mixture of frustration and urgency. They emphasized that any help from Brian could be crucial in locating Gabby, but he remained unreachable. Around this time, authorities discovered police body cam footage from an incident that occurred in Moab, Utah on August 12th, before Gabby was officially reported missing. An emergency call had come in from a bystander claiming to have seen a couple involved in some type of dispute. When the police arrived, they found Gabby and Brian near their van. In the recorded footage, Gabby appeared visibly upset, while Brian offered calm but somewhat evasive responses. The couple downplayed the encounter, attributing the conflict to the strains of long-distance travel and the everyday anxieties that can arise when two people share a small space for an extended period. Ultimately, the officers recommended that they spend the night apart to cool down. There were no arrests, and the incident was classified as a mental or emotional health break rather than a crime. As the official investigation ramped up, local police worked in collaboration with the FBI, who recognized this could be a multi-state case. The authorities questioned Brian's parents, trying to ascertain any detail that might help locate Gabby, but they too seemed reluctant to share much. The public caught wind of Brian's silence and responded with growing outrage. Despite the fervor, official statements from Brian's side were sparse. His attorney maintained that Brian had done nothing wrong and had simply chosen to exercise his constitutional right to remain silent. This legal stance did little to quell the rampant speculation that he was hiding something monumental. Meanwhile, Gabby's family organized their own search efforts. They circulated missing person flyers with Gabby's photo, physical description, and last known whereabouts. Volunteers began scanning highway rest stops and campgrounds in the states along the couple's intended route. Online communities pored over potential sightings, trying to coordinate tips in a shared effort to bring Gabby home. Even individuals with no direct connection to the couple became emotionally invested, spurred on by Gabby's online presence and the subsequent heartbreak of her unexplained absence. Some supporters took it upon themselves to contact local rangers in national parks to see if they had encountered the couple, while others used satellite mapping tools to look for signs of a white van parked in remote areas. The heartbreak and frustration in Gabby's parents' voices during interviews only fueled the collective resolve, prompting more and more people to rally behind them. Throughout this period, the formal investigation was not without its challenges. The wide expanse of the American West made for a vast search perimeter, and if Gabby was truly off-grid somewhere, time was of the essence. Investigators sifted through an avalanche of tips, many of which led to dead ends or were based on rumor rather than verifiable fact. Nevertheless, the authorities pursued each lead with the understanding that even the smallest detail, an overlooked security camera snippet from a gas station, a neighbor's recollection of a van passing through at a certain time, could prove pivotal. On September 19, a group of searchers combing the wilderness near Grand Teton National Park came upon a site that would change the course of the investigation forever. They found a human matching the general description of Gabby Petito. Ever since her disappearance, the local authorities and the FBI had concentrated much of their manpower in this rugged, wild terrain, guided by reports that the couple's van had last been seen in the area. Though leads had trickled in from across the country, the most credible pieces of evidence consistently pointed search teams to the forests, waterways, and backcountry roads that weave through Wyoming's mountain landscapes. The day before this grim discovery, local law enforcement had urged volunteers to stay vigilant, to scan the peripheries of campsites and pathways, because even the slightest clue, a piece of discarded clothing or a campsite's log entry, could offer a breakthrough in a case that had both law enforcement and the nation on edge. The atmosphere became palpably somber, because until that moment, there had always been room for hope. Hope that Gabby was simply lost, out of communication range, or nursing an injury in a remote area. Now that delicate optimism was shattered, replaced by dread and an urgent need for answers. The FBI took immediate charge of the scene, establishing a broad perimeter and calling in specialists to carefully document the area. Forensic investigators set to work, marking footprints, tire tracks, and any other anomalies that might point to what had happened. Park rangers, well-versed in the terrain, assisted by identifying paths commonly used by hikers and off-road vehicles, attempting to reconstruct the final steps that led to this secluded spot. The sheer gravity of the find settled over everyone present, reminding them that this would no longer be a missing person case, but something far more tragic. At first, officials made only a brief announcement. They had recovered a human consistent with Gabby's physical characteristics. Pending a formal identification, they refrained from divulging specifics about the condition of the site, understanding the raw emotional weight this news carried for the family and for a public already deeply invested in Gabby's fate. Back in Florida, reporters surrounded Gabby's parents' home, waiting for any reaction. Family members, friends, and neighbors together, providing what emotional support they could while reeling from the possibility that all their worst fears might be coming true. Within a day of the discovery, a studying was ordered by the Teton County Coroner's Office, and law enforcement indicated that a rapid identification process was their highest priority. The presence of forensic teams and specialized search dogs suggested that investigators were methodically gathering evidence to determine not only identity, but also any clues about the manner and timeline of death. Park officials closed off sections of the surrounding land to maintain the integrity of the scene, as helicopters hovered overhead, filming from a distance as part of both the official operation and the media coverage. In that tense interlude, Gabby's name dominated headlines, and a collective kind of vigil took shape, with online posts urging continued prayers, positivity, and love. The heartbreak for Gabby's parents and step-parents deepened when law enforcement officially confirmed what many had feared. It was Gabby Petito. In a statement delivered by an FBI spokesperson, they offered condolences to the Petito family while also assuring the public that the investigation would not end here. Once the identification was made, the tone of official communications shifted significantly. Instead of focusing solely on a rescue or missing person search, authorities now handled it as a case of likely foul play. Although they declined to provide specific details about the cause or manner of death in those earliest announcements, citing the importance of preserving the integrity of the investigation, they did indicate there was reason to suspect a crime. On the investigative front, the discovery of Gabby's transformed the urgency of the case. Forensic analysts began scrutinizing every scrap of evidence from the site. Soil samples, potential footprints, and any items that might have been left behind, such as personal belongings, pieces of fabric, or traces of material that could link the scene to a specific person. Digital forensics teams continued poring over phone data, social media logs, and any new eyewitness accounts that could corroborate the last known movements of Gabby and Brian in that region. The goal was to piece together the final days and hours of Gabby's life, establishing a timeline that might shine light on who was responsible. Many turned their attention back to Brian Laundrie, whose silence following his solitary return to Florida had already ignited intense scrutiny. Calls for him to share what he knew reached a crescendo, with some commentators labeling him the only person who could answer the haunting questions now looming over the entire case. News outlets broadcast round-the-clock coverage of the property, showing a seemingly deserted driveway while anchors rehashed known details and replayed snippets of body cam footage. In online forums, debates raged about whether Brian's silence was an admission of guilt or a sign of legal strategy. Others believed this was a clear indication that he was withholding key information that could explain the tragic discovery in Wyoming. Meanwhile, Gabby's parents, now overwhelmed by grief, dedicated themselves to cooperating with law enforcement, even as they navigated a deluge of interview requests from media outlets who wanted reactions to the coroner's findings, theories about motive, or statements about how they were coping. Despite their sorrow, they emphasized the importance of finding the complete truth. They urged the public to focus on the facts and to support the ongoing investigation, rather than descending into unhelpful speculation or online vigilantism. The confirmation of evidence also pushed police to intensify their search for Brian. Almost immediately after public questions about Brian's whereabouts took center stage. Was he even still in Florida, living under the radar at his parents' house, or had he slipped away to another region altogether? Rumors floated that his family knew more than they were letting on, while some suggested he might have fled under cover of darkness before law enforcement could establish definitive grounds for an arrest. Law enforcement refrained from naming him as a suspect outright, instead referring to him as a person of interest, but the subtext felt inescapable. Having been the last person known to be with Gabby, his role in the unfolding tragedy loomed large. The FBI announced that anyone spotting Brian or having relevant information should contact them immediately. Tips began pouring in from multiple states, with people claiming to have seen Brian at campsites, on roadsides, and even at remote hostels. Most of these sightings were unsubstantiated, but each led investigators to chase leads, broaden their net, and coordinate with local law enforcement agencies throughout the country. Initially, it appeared that Brian was simply holed up in his family's house, protected by his parents. They had asked reporters to respect their privacy, communicating only through an attorney, a decision that drew widespread ire and led to a storm of media commentary. But in mid-September, that hush around Brian's whereabouts morphed into a startling revelation. He was missing. According to his parents' statements, he had left their home on foot on September 13, 2 days after Gabby was officially reported missing, saying that he was heading to the Carlton Reserve, a sprawling wildlife area filled with hiking trails, swamps, and dense foliage. The Laundrie family lawyer told authorities that Brian was distraught, though they offered no concrete details about his frame of mind or precise destination within the reserve. It took several days before the parents disclosed that he had not come home, triggering confusion and frustration for investigators who were already trying to piece together a complex timeline. Many wondered why Brian's parents had not promptly notified the authorities that he had left, especially given the gravity of Gabby's case and the widespread calls for Brian's cooperation. The fact that they waited until September 17th to declare him missing compounded suspicion that the family might be obstructing the investigation, though Brian's attorney repeatedly insisted that was not the case. Suddenly, the Northport Police Department in Florida found itself coordinating a large-scale manhunt for Brian in the wilds of the Carlton Reserve. This dense preserve stretches over 20 square miles and is known for its challenging terrain: thick undergrowth, waterlogged areas, alligators, snakes, and swarms of insects. Anyone seeking solitude or trying to disappear could find the place daunting, but it also offered numerous opportunities for concealment. Dozens of officers, equipped with drones, all-terrain vehicles, and canine units, painstakingly searched trails and waterlogged corridors, hoping to find a sign of Brian, a discarded backpack, footprints, or even direct sightings. The unpredictability of Florida's weather further complicated the effort, as heavy rains could flood entire sections of the reserve, erasing potential clues. Helicopters circled overhead, scanning the canopy and open clearings for any trace of movement. Yet, day after day, officials emerged from the swamp with little more than exhaustion. No campsite, no confirmed footprints, no new leads that pointed conclusively to Brian's location. Each press briefing had a similar refrain. The terrain was difficult, the environment hazardous, and there had been no sightings definitively tying Brian to the reserve. But they continued the search, driven by the possibility that he might still be out there, surviving off limited rations or tapping into survival skills he had gained from years of camping. The public response ranged from skepticism to outright disbelief. Some believed Brian's parents had orchestrated a ruse, intentionally directing law enforcement to the reserve to buy Brian time to flee elsewhere. Others insisted that he could not possibly survive in such a harsh environment for an extended period. Sightings of Brian started popping up in different corners of the country, from small towns in Alabama to the Appalachian Trail in North Carolina. Hikers reported spotting a man who resembled Brian's physical description, leading to a flurry of 911 calls in multiple jurisdictions. Each tip triggered a wave of speculation and, at times, brief local searches by law enforcement. Yet none panned out in a definitive way. Online sleuths took to combing through posted videos from all across the Southeast, scanning crowds at music festivals or trailheads, convinced they might spot a stray image of the missing fiancé. Meanwhile, the FBI expanded its scope, collaborating with law enforcement agencies beyond Florida to ensure that if Brian attempted to cross state lines, he would be caught. They set up a hotline dedicated exclusively to tips about his location, and the calls poured in by the hundreds. Amid the chaos, investigators continued to examine evidence seized from the Laundrie home, from the van that Brian and Gabby shared, and from Gabby's personal belongings. Their goal was to understand the timeline of events between the couple's last confirmed sighting and the day Brian drove back to Florida alone. Digital forensics experts dug into cell phone data, social media accounts, and any lingering digital footprints that might link Brian to certain geographical coordinates. Authorities even issued an arrest, in specifically the alleged illegal use of a debit card. This meant that if Brian surfaced anywhere and law enforcement encountered him, they had grounds to detain him. As the search stretched on, tensions flared between the Laundrie family and the Petito family. The Laundries, for their part, maintained that they were fully cooperating by turning over any relevant items, but that they could not compel Brian to turn himself in or speak with investigators if he chose not to. Still, day after day, the official search in the reserve turned up no tangible results, and the swirling rumors from across the country seemed to lead nowhere substantial. Amid these uncertainties, a few new clues emerged. It became public knowledge that Brian's vehicle, which he had reportedly driven to the reserve's entrance, was found with a parking ticket. His parents later retrieved the vehicle, adding another layer of confusion. Why pick up the car if they believed he was still in the reserve? Did Brian notify them somehow, or leave a note suggesting a plan to return? Media outlets starved for concrete updates pored over these details, trying to piece together a coherent timeline that might explain how Brian could have ventured into the wilderness without supplies and disappeared so thoroughly. Meanwhile, law enforcement broadened their search perimeter beyond the original area, even employing specialized diving units to explore underwater sections of the reserve. Days became weeks, with each fruitless search raising more questions about whether Brian was truly there at all. By early October, the official narrative remained static. Brian Laundrie was a person of interest in Gabby Petito's homicide investigation, had been missing for several weeks, and was the subject of one of the most high-profile searches in recent memory. The FBI scaled back certain portions of their daily search, noting that they would now focus on more strategic, intelligence-driven operations. In mid-October, with the water levels dropping, there was fresh ground to explore. A portion of the reserve previously inaccessible due to flooding. It was here that law enforcement would soon discover personal items believed to belong to Brian: a backpack, a notebook, and other possessions scattered near a patch of brush. While the FBI remained tight-lipped about the specifics, stating only that the Laundrie family attorney had informed them of Brian's potential interest in that area, it was evident the search had gained a renewed urgency. For a moment, the discovery of these personal effects reignited the question of whether Brian was still alive. Some theorized he might have left the items behind to throw off the investigation. But the story would take a final dramatic turn when, near these belongings, search teams found human. The authorities quickly cordoned off the site, bringing in forensic experts. Forensic experts worked tirelessly, often well into the night. The process involved a combination of dental records, DNA testing, and careful scrutiny of physical evidence at the scene. It was there, under the harsh glare of camera lights, that police finally confirmed what many had come to suspect. The human in the reserve was Brian Laundrie. As law enforcement teams stood down from the daily slog through swampland, the media pivoted to a new angle. If Brian is gone, how would the truth of Gabby's final moments emerge? For many, the realization set in that no interrogation, no trial, and no first-hand account would ever surface to fill the void in the timeline or offer the precise details that might explain the outcome. Almost immediately after the official identification of Brian's, attention shifted to the items found alongside them. There was a backpack, some miscellaneous belongings, and most intriguingly, a notebook. The FBI moved swiftly to secure these materials as evidence. Experts in digital and forensic analysis began the painstaking task of deciphering any writing that survived the Florida elements: humidity, water damage, and the natural decay processes that might have compromised the legibility of each page. What became clear from official updates was that the notebook did include statements tying Brian to Gabby's final days, enough that the FBI publicly stated he had taken responsibility. Although the exact wording was not released immediately, a strategic decision to avoid compromising any outstanding investigative threads, this admission propelled the authorities toward formally closing Gabby's case from a legal standpoint. In practical terms, if Brian survived, his statements might have laid the groundwork for a judicial investigation. By late 2021, official statements began referencing the closure of the primary file on Gabby's homicide. The FBI noted that evidence collected from Brian's notebook, combined with the overall findings at the crime scene and from digital data, formed a coherent picture of what had unfolded. Inside the discovered notebook, Brian confessed to everything, took full responsibility, and offered a final apology to everyone. They emphasized that no other individuals were being investigated in connection with Gabby's death, meaning no further arrests or indictments would follow. In parallel, small memorial services and tributes continued, not just in Gabby's hometown, but also in various communities across the nation. Tiny shrines on roadways and trailheads bore her name, sometimes accompanied by pictures of her radiant smile, capturing the wistful memory of someone who had sought to celebrate life in all its natural wonder. In the months that followed, legal consequences did surface in a different context. The Petito family pursued a civil lawsuit, claiming that Brian's parents had withheld knowledge that could have hastened the search for Gabby or clarified her condition sooner. In their final statement, investigators thanked the many agencies, volunteers, and online communities that contributed to the search efforts, while also expressing profound condolences to Gabby's loved ones. Given the severity of the crime and the strong likelihood of conviction if a trial had been possible, observers concluded that the sentence would have been unrelenting. As various prosecutors and attorneys privately weighed in, they surmised that, under the existing federal statutes and with the aggravating circumstances presented, the Brian Laundrie would have received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole.